I think Scott Drew to Kentucky is legitimate and more than possible at this point, which is not something I said about Scott to Louisville. It's not something I said about Scott anywhere else. And there are some weird intricacies that don't make a lot of sense and point in an odd direction. Jeff Goodman, for example, big time, powerful writer in college basketball, plays pickleball with Scott Drew yesterday, 2 days ago, the day that it broke that John Calipari would maybe consider the Arkansas job. There were already murmurs of this. There have been Locked On shows about it. There were articles about it saying, hey, is this a possibility? And then that same day, the same afternoon after Jeff and Scott play pickleball, that news breaks that Calipari is headed off to Arkansas. And the first thing that Goodman says when interviewed about the opening at Kentucky is, I think Scott Drew is a viable option. Now, maybe I'm playing tinfoil hat here, but the guys that hung out the day of, if I'm Jeff Goodman, I'm hanging out with Scott Drew, and I believe that there is nothing in the entire planet that could ever pull him away from Baylor. Why would I put his name in the hat first? I don't think it's just because I was with him. I mean, if I knew he wasn't ever going to leave Baylor, it'd be stupid for me to put my name in the hat. And also, Jeff was pretty strong that Scott wouldn't go to Louisville. Those two guys are friends. They're close. And I need you to know that every coach in the country is at the very end of the day looking out what's best for them and their family. Kentucky calls. How do you say no? When Louisville calls, they're in a bad spot. They've been in a rough spot. There is a rebuild there. That's tough. When Kentucky calls, it's different. I was reading On 3 today. Pete Thamel talking about the possibility of Scott Drew coming to Kentucky, coming to Lexington, and says, you know what? In a more realistic candidate list, this again per On 3, I would look at Scott Drew at Baylor. He and Mitch Barnhart have a relationship going back to the bubble at the NCAA tournament, Thamel said. Baylor won the 2021 NCAA tournament, and Mitch Barnhart was the committee chair. He was in the Baylor hotel and assigned to the team, so they spent a month together. I think because Scott listened to Louisville, he would give Kentucky a listen. Kentucky has more resources and a better league moving forward, which I think is wrong. It's something Scott Drew is likely to entertain. Now, according to BetMGM, the highest paid college basketball coaches start with Bill Self at Kansas, $9.6 million, John Calipari at Kentucky, $8.5 million, and you go down to 6 on that list, it is Scott Drew at Baylor, $5.1 million. But if Kansas Bill Self is making close to $10 million and Kentucky really wants Scott Drew and Barnhart and Drew are actually friends, there's no reason to think that Kentucky won't make him the highest paid coach in college basketball or pretty close to it, at least in that $9.5 million range, saying, Scott, we know you just got an extension from Baylor. We'll double it. We'll pay you $10 million. You're making 5.1. We'll pay you $10 million. We want you that bad in Lexington. And I don't care who you are. I don't. You're gonna take a long, hard look at that offer. And I didn't feel like Louisville was a job that is worth leaving Baylor for. Scott's family is there. His kids have been in Waco. I mean, this is a university that made him. His dad was a lifer at Valparaiso. Everything is pointed in every step, whether it was Indiana or Louisville or Michigan. It's just Scott is going to stay at Baylor. Then this one comes out, and the pundits who are close to him, the ones who kind of float his name out sometimes, but usually know that he's going to stick with his guns and stick in Waco, are putting him at the top of the list for Kentucky, saying that Jay Wright is unrealistic right now. Billy Donovan might not leave the NBA, and going to get Nate Oates is not going to happen. He already said he's coming back to Alabama. So when everybody points to Scott Drew, when everybody says, hey, you could be the next head coach of Alabama football, it doesn't really matter where you are, your current circumstances, or what you're doing. Your love for a university, it's even tough for me to say, like, everybody's got a dollar sign. I'm not even saying that Kentucky can just outright buy Scott Drew. It'd have to be the right offer with the right culture, the right opportunity to build a culture. And I think Kentucky gives it to him. It's the college basketball powerhouse. It is like Mecca of college basketball. There is nowhere that can pump that kind of resource. And that's an offer that if you're Scott, if Pete Thamel was right, and he actually heard out Louisville, he will hear out Kentucky. And as someone who went to Baylor, as someone who has worked not really along, but in the same realm as Scott Drew, covered Scott Drew closely for 4 years, this is the first one that's really scared me. This is the first one where I thought, oh, that's a tough one to turn down. And I think Scott will not only take a look at it, but if there's ever been an opening that pulls him away from Baylor, it's this. And if he goes to Kentucky, I won't be shocked. And you tip your cat, you bid adieu and say, all right, I completely understand. Thank you. Thank you for your service. Where is Bryce Drew? Where is Jerome Tang? Where is John Jacobs? Please come back. But boy, I just got that weird gut feeling, that little gut knot of this might be the big one, Elizabeth. This one might do it for Scott Drew. Guess we'll see. I'll cover that and more tomorrow. Let's talk with Steven Simcox, Locked On TCU, about what those guys are up to and where teams like TCU and Baylor and Texas Tech sit in terms of the rest of the Big 12 and expansion. This has been and always will be Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.